What's one word or one area? So it might be scheduling. It might be health and safety. It might be technology. Let's see what comes up. So far we have safety, finance. If you're just joining us, if you missed the beginning, we're using Mentimeter for the next 2 or 3 minutes. If you go to the website at the top here, menti.com, you can do it on your phone. You don't have to have an app for it, and you type in the number 492750. So let's take a look and see if we have any common responses here. I see safety coming up several times. Let's see, we see social distancing. I would think that would go along with safety. We see health and safety. That's another one. Scheduling is another. Curriculum, Common Core. We'll go for just another 10 seconds or so. What else we get? And keep scrolling down. See, once again, health and safety is coming up again. Scheduling. Excellent. MashaAllah. So enrollment numbers, enrollment, safety and school calendar. I think we all can see some themes here, can we not? Right? I think these are fair for Islamic schools to have these all in common. Let's move to the next one. Right now, I'm going to ask you, we're not going to answer these questions right now, but I just want to kind of see in the room. So if you had to ask one question right now, one question about planning for next year, what would it be? Something that you wish you had an answer for. That might be, what is the best schedule that we can use for next year? When does school open? When is it safe? Anything, if you had one question, you wish someone could answer it for you, what would that question be? First one that came up is, how can we plan together as Islamic schools? Love it.
Yeah.
Love it. That's a really good one. Let's see what else. When will school open? Good one. How can we provide quality education? Yes, very important. When can we resume normal classes? So that's a theme there. What is the best schedule? Best schedule? When is it safe to open? You see how these questions are pretty similar to each other. What is the best way to promote learning during these times? How can we schedule preschoolers? Very good. How can we start school in the fall? Let's look at a few more. How can we plan for operations when admissions and fundraising will be affected? Effective scheduling. We see scheduling pops up a lot here. Would it be safe to open school buildings? And what criteria will we use for safety in schools? Wow, so we have a lot of participants here. So we may not be able to look at all of them, but I think we can see it's fair that we have a pretty strong theme here of similar concerns. The last question I'm going to ask here, and I would just ask you to wait 1 second before you push a number so that you know what the question will be, is I'm going to transition. So now we're talking first about all these things, what we're worried about, right? What are we going to do? We sense that we're anxious and we have a lot of questions, really specific questions, it seems. I want to ask you this question though, is that on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being almost never or rarely, 5 being very frequently or almost always, how often do you talk to others in your school, in your community, about your school's purpose, your school's vision, your school's mission these days? How often do you feel that you're doing it? And you can be honest, right? It's okay if it's almost never. We're focused on the fires, on the things in front of us. Right now, let's see what the responses are coming out. All right, alhamdulillah, looks like we've got some good ones coming in. It's like the majority here are fairly often or usually. We have some that are almost never. That's an honest response. Seldom, once in a while is there too. That's our second highest. Let's give it another 10 seconds or so, see how many responses we get in here. So far, the majority is like fairly often, usually, which is good. And let's give it 5 more seconds and see where our results are. Looks like that's about what we have so far. So it looks like, yeah, the majority here are fairly often, although we have a pretty good mix. Is that fair to say? So what we're gonna do is I am going to switch over now to the presentation. And let me try this to make sure that it comes up properly. So I'm going to come to my part of the presentation, and we're going to circle back to what we just talked about. And that data, that response that you gave, I'm actually going to show you what research reveals when it comes to how often you talk about your vision and connect your vision to what you're doing. And that is the very topic that I will speak about now in the next 15 or 20 minutes. And the topic of this section is first why, then what. As we could see in the very beginning, we have a lot of what and how questions, but it's really important that we as Islamic school leaders stop and reflect on our why first before we determine what we are going to do. So we do the Mentimeter already, and the goals really are going to be establishing why this has to come, and then we're going to talk about some actual practical applications for how we can connect our school's purpose, what people really care about in our communities, with what we have to do in a really difficult to plan for environment. I wanted to start off with this image here, first and foremost. Research shows that when you use images, metaphors, that it really helps connect the message that you're trying to get across. It's the way our brains are wired. When I was looking through images, I found this of a nighttime. And I feel like this nighttime is the darkness, kind of represents a way many of us feel. Remember at the very beginning, many of us said anxious, worried. This darkness represents that, right? There are a lot of questions that we have. And the truth is, the honest truth, is that many of those questions don't have answers that anyone can give with 100% certainty. For example, the question might be, when will it be safe to open schools? And we know from what we hear that even the biggest experts in viruses often will hesitate to answer that question because it's really hard to predict. The situation is moving constantly. It's causing a lot of anxiety for all of us. But if you look on this image, you will see a picture of someone holding a light. And the light is something that we can think of as our school's purpose, our vision, our mission, why our schools exist. And while we may not be able to answer every question about what to expect for next year, everyone can stop and reflect on what their purpose is. The next part I want to talk about a little bit, and I'm going to reference some research from two authors named Kouzes and Posner. They have a book that's called The Leadership Challenge. I'm a certified facilitator in that, and that's just a lot of what I'm going to reference. It's heavily research-based, and part of their research is very powerful for us to start with. It starts off with the power of why. If we read this together, it says, researchers have shown that stressing the why to people, as in why we are doing this and why does it matter, activates the brain's reward system and increases not only people's efforts, but how they feel about what they are doing. How many of us want to activate people's brains' reward systems? We all want to do this. We all want people who feel rewarded, who feel motivated, and feel good about what it is that they are doing. You have to think about why and how why can be used to do this. One of the things I'm going to mention, another example, and this comes from a different author. This comes from Simon Sinek in his book, Starting with Why. And I think this is a really great example that this author uses. He uses two companies that are technology companies, which I think is very appropriate in the days that we are living in now. He talks about what is a what company or organization and what is a why. And he gives an example. The example of a what company, a company that defines itself by what it does, is Dell. So the example would be, what does Dell do? Dell is a company that makes computers. We make computers for all different budget ranges. We have the low end, the affordable kind. We have the high end for people who are computer programmers. We make computers. It's what we do. On the other hand, he talks about what a why company is, and he gives the example of Apple. Apple is a company that defines itself by why it exists. And if anyone is familiar with Apple in the time with Steve Jobs, especially in the 80s and 90s, there was an ad campaign that was called Think Different. So Apple was about think different. It's not even grammatical, but it is a very powerful statement. Apple branded itself as an organization for people who want to challenge the status quo. If you are a kind of person that wants to think differently, who wants to be a different kind of person, to innovate, you need an Apple. This is the product for you. They did not say, we make computers, they're good computers, they're sleek. It is, we make this for this kind of person. The next picture that I'm going to show you, I think, exemplifies the difference between perhaps Apple and Dell in this regard. If you type in to Google, Apple product launch, you have so many different pictures to choose from. This is one, I believe it is in China. You find many in the United States, where if you look at any Apple product launch, you will see that there are people who stand in lines. This line very likely snakes outside and continues for quite a while. And people are willing to stand outside in the rain, camp out overnight to get an Apple phone. Why is that, right? I would challenge you, just as an aside, if you want to do it after this webinar, is to do a Google search and search for Dell product launch line, right? And try to find a line of people wrapping around a building for a Dell product. Now, I'm not saying anything bad about Dell. I have a Dell computer in my office. I like it, right? But it's a really powerful example of how organizations that focus on their why really motivate people and make people feel part of it. Well, another really important point for us is to consider for schools as school leaders, for boards, is to notice that the why is the most powerful thing that we have for nonprofit organizations. I imagine that many of you have heard of the book Good to Great, but I don't know how many of you may be aware that Jim Collins, the author of this very, very famous book that's used throughout schools, businesses, that he ended up creating a shorter version, an addendum, so to speak, of this book that was called Good to Great for Social Sectors. And in this book, he makes a point, and the biggest point in his book is to talk about how we must distinguish between for-profit organizations and nonprofit organizations. For-profit organizations, businesses, companies have shareholders. Their success is defined by the value of their shareholders, the returns for their shareholders, and profit numbers. Whereas nonprofit organizations, if you're really being faithful to the nonprofits, their success is measured by the achievement of the vision and mission of that organization. Think about it, right? People who work in our schools, people who come to our schools, right? It's a different set of expectations. Why do people volunteer? Why do people work in schools where they're paid, let's be honest, far below what they should be paid for the amount of work they do? It's because they believe in the purpose. And in times like these, when things get very chaotic, we cannot lose sight of that purpose. And we need to really reflect on it, and we need to continue to talk about it and figure out how we connect what we're doing moving forward with that purpose. There's another really important point related to this to consider for all of us, is about the idea of leadership versus management. Here's a point, and many of these two words are often misconstrued, or they're used interchangeably when they really shouldn't be. First and foremost, a manager, if we look at the definition of a manager is someone who plans, budgets, organizes, allocates, solves problems. Manage comes from the Latin word manus, which means hand. It's someone who does things who keeps things going as they are. Management is important. We need management in our schools, and we as leaders have to be able to manage. But one point that is often lost is, what is the definition of a leader? While management is about solving and maintaining what we have now, a leader is someone who shows direction, who aligns and influences, and who motivates and inspires people. In a time of crisis like we're in right now, people are not yearning for managers. People are yearning for leaders. And all of us have that responsibility to step up and think like leaders. So we need management to run our schools. We need leadership to get through this and beyond, but we must avoid a common problem in organizations. That common problem is being overmanaged and underled, meaning we're focusing just on what's in front of us, just those things, the fires, which there are things that we must address. I'm not saying that we ignore those, but we have to continuously keep our eye on the future. I know that's why many of you have come here, to figure out how to plan for the future, but we have to connect that to our greater purpose as well. Going back to Kouzes and Posner and the leadership challenge, they talk about 5 practices of exemplary leaders. The second one is inspiring a shared vision. They talk about, what do effective leaders do? Research shows, 25, 30 plus years of research shows with millions of participants, that number 1, leaders envision the future by imagining exciting and ennobling possibilities. Things are tough right now, but let's not forget that we have to be positive. We have to be optimistic. We have to envision a future that's not there yet, and it has to be exciting. It has to be ennobling. It has to be connected to that deeper purpose that our schools exist for. Second part of what effective leaders do when it comes to a vision is that they enlist others in a common vision. Remember, vision is not just about the vision I have in my head, but effective leaders inspire a shared vision. They see what they really are looking for, and then what their constituents, the people around them, are passionate about, aligning those together to make taking everyone together in a shared aspiration. So the question that all of us, myself, everyone here on the call, and everyone dealing in education these days, especially Islamic schools, is we have to think about How clear is our why? First of all, on a personal level, why do you do what you do? Do you consider your job as an administrator, a board member, a teacher, volunteer in an Islamic school, just something that you do on the side? Is it just income for you? I would assume the answer to that question is no. I assume it's because you're driven for a higher cause to provide a service, an important service for Muslim youth, right? For their future. So think about why you do what you do and why your organization exists. I want to come back to this question. Remember we had in the very beginning, we had a 1 through 5 scale question. That question was, on a scale of 1 to 5, how often do you talk about or connect your school's vision or purpose? This is research from the same authors from the Leadership Challenge. This is with over 3 million participants who have used the LPI, which is called the Leadership Practices Inventory, which is one of the most reliable and valid leadership research tools out there. Let's take a look at what this says, and let's reflect on our own answers and see what most people tend to say when we do what we do. Look at the bottom. It says, leaders show others that their long-term interests can be realized by enlisting in a common vision. We have that on this side. On the other axis, we have a percentage of direct reports, the people who work under those leaders, who agree that they are making a difference. I would think it's fair to say that we want all of our people to feel that they are making a difference, that they're not just working, that they're not just going through the motions. Look what happens when leaders, they say their leaders almost never or rarely connect what they're doing to a common vision. Only 6% feel that they're making a difference. 6. What about the other 94%? Don't feel like they're making a difference. That's an issue for us if we are a vision-based nonprofit organization. Only 14%, it goes up if the leader seldomly does it. So if you increase your frequency, you get more people making a difference. If you occasionally or sometimes do it, you have 30% who feel like they're making a difference. If they fairly often, the leader fairly often, usually 90%, and look at the number, 90% if the leader very frequently or almost always shows others how their long-term interests can be connected to a common vision. I think it's fair to say that we want to be from that group. So with all of this said, is that we know moving forward that we are going to have to be rethinking most aspects of school as we have known it moving forward. We need to look at some particular scenarios. So we first need to think about what our why is, talk to other people about our whys, and make sure that our why is very, very clear, right? As Islamic schools, our why is different from public schools. Think about a scenario to give some concrete application for this. So connecting a decision to why. Here's the scenario. At our school, at the Islamic School Louisville, the morning assembly is a big part of our normal routine. We've been doing it forever. And that's just, I think that's fair to say in many of the schools I visited that many schools do something similar. So your school may not be able to hold an in-person morning assembly. I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying it's just a possibility that it may not be an option to do it because of the need to social distance kids. We normally do it with all our students in one shared area. It's to gather kids together, to feel a sense of community. And it's a key part of our culture. As we move forward with having to make decisions like this, there's a few guiding questions that are very helpful to us as leaders when we have to make these decisions. Number one, why did your school do this? In this case, this is the morning assembly. In our school, we did it because it's a key part for us to teach Islamic values. We have a hadith of the week, an ayah of the week. We have kids get in front of each other, act out, make it engaging for them. And we have the group dua. It builds a sense of community. So now we know why. We did not stop with, well, we had a morning assembly. That's what we did. How else do we do a morning assembly? We have to figure out why we did the morning assembly first. Second thing is we have to figure out how else could we accomplish this why in a different way. One way might be, and it's usually how all of us think, is to say, well, perhaps we could do a live broadcast of our assembly from the assembly area into the classrooms, put more monitors in the room, the kids can watch it. That might work. We also can go a step further. While we know our why, we might not be able to do exactly an assembly. Maybe that particular approach doesn't work. Maybe we're reflecting on what the why was. We did it because we wanted to build a sense of community. We wanted kids to see each other acting. We wanted to see each other doing a theme or value for us. Maybe we can come up with something completely different. So it doesn't have to necessarily be this or this. It can be an option C. And then finally, how do we connect our why and what with our stakeholders. So we decide to make a new change. We're no longer having the morning assembly. Are we simply going to tell parents, sorry, no more morning assembly because of COVID-19? People may just hear that and say, okay, well, that's a bummer. And well, we're losing things in our school. But here's an example of maybe what we could do if we make a different decision or we replace it with something else that gets to the same why. So at the Islamic School of, insert the name of your school, we exist to insert your vision, right? To instill high quality academics, to create 21st century Islamic learners who are confident in their religion, who are able to, whatever it might be. While there have been some changes to how our school operates as a result of the current pandemic, we are still committed to doing this, this, and this. For this reason, we are excited. Here's the positive element, right? We're being positive about the future to announce a new program that will still allow students to do this by this new approach. So we've told people it's not simply, sorry, we're not doing that anymore. What are we going to do? It is, here's why we exist. Here's what we did. Here's what we're going to do now that still meets that. We have found in our school that when we've had to make some of these decisions, when parents know that why, if you explain it to them and front load it, you tell them before you even before the decision is even announced, people will buy into it much more than if you just tell them, we're doing it this way. That's it. Couple things I'm just going to end on here is, this is a slide I think is very powerful. People commit to causes, they don't commit to plans. Did Martin Luther King, on this hot day with 200,000 people in Washington, D.C., who were standing to hear him, did he say, I have a list of measurable objectives? Did he say, I have done a SWOT analysis and I have come up with a strategic plan that's going to get us through it? I'm not saying those things aren't important. We need to do those things. He did not say, I have a list of measurable objectives. He said, I have a dream. So as we see that, remember that it's really huge for us to think constantly about what that higher purpose is. So we need to appeal to common ideals. We need to take pride in being unique. We need to paint a positive image of the future. Let's not forget that we as Islamic schools, we are unique. We are not like everyone else. Now is the time for us to emphasize how we are different, how we're doing things that other people are in need of. Keep in mind, it's really important to talk to people, do surveys, conversations, group activities for your school's purpose and mission. There's so many things that we can share. I know the time is probably running low, so I'm going to move through it. These are some resources that I've referenced here, so you can always go back to it. These slides are going to be shared. My email is here at the bottom too, so if you want to reach out and talk about any of those particular things, you're more than welcome to. And one last thing is that I found this while rummaging through the internet. You can find some great things sometimes, is that a vision without a plan is just a dream. So we have to have a plan. We can't just say, I have a dream and be done with it. We have to back it up with something solid. A plan without a vision is just drudgery. So remember, let's not just have a plan, but not have it linked to a higher purpose. And the last point is, but a vision with a plan can change the world. I wish everyone the best of luck. And if we have time at the end, I'm more than happy to answer any questions if they're related to this topic or anything else I can help with. Thank you.
Jazakumullahu khairan, Brother William, for taking us through that. I know it's so important to kind of zoom out of our day-to-day lives and operations with this pandemic going on and look at the why and why we're here. And it's so important to keep that in the forefront of our planning, as you mentioned. So thank you again. With that being said, I'd like to open up the floor to the audience of the Islamic schools out there. Do you have any questions for Brother William in asking him why this topic is so important before we start planning? All right. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat box. We're going to move on to our next presenter, who's with us from the land down under, Brother Nadeem Mayman. He's coming to us from Australia. He just finished his suhoor, everyone. And we asked that Brother Nadeem, I hope we made dua for us while you prayed Fajr. Dr. Nadeem Mayman is a senior research fellow in the Center of Islamic Thought. He is also in the School of Education at the University of South Australia. His research focuses on teacher education with a particular emphasis on Islamic pedagogy, comparative faith-based schooling, and a philosophy of religious education and culturally relevant and responsive teaching. He's the author of the History of Islamic Schooling in North America, Mapping Growth and Evolution, and the co-editor of Philosophies of Islamic Education, Historical Perspectives and Emerging Discourses. Prior to going to Australia, Brother Nadim was the Director of Education at Razi Education, where he spearheaded the design and implementation of an online teacher certificate program and the Islamic Teacher Education Program in collaboration with the University of Toronto. Brother Nadim, you ready?
Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Uram, for the introduction. Jazakallah khairan, everyone else, for attending and for your patience. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa hlul uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Yes, I'm Canadian, living down under, and it is Suhoor here, just finished Fajr, alhamdulillah. I want to begin this topic for today, for my next 15 or 20 minutes, is about nurturing tarbiyah online. But I want to begin with an acknowledgement of the privileged state that we're in. I read an article a few weeks back that spoke about COVID-19 that said that that self-isolation is really for the privileged. And I think a lot of us have been throwing around the term that, you know, this time is an opportunity for us. But at the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge that the implications and the realities of COVID-19 have been very real for many of us. The loss of loved ones, our health, our wellness, our well-being has been impacted, and for many of us in different ways, economically as well. So with that in mind, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that this is not necessarily an opportunity for all of us, and this is not necessarily something that you know, all of us have been able to welcome in the same way. So when we take that into consideration, you know, it softens our heart, I think. And a scholar I was following said something. He said something interesting. He said, you know, it's amazing how Allah has allowed for this tiny molecule to bring humanity to its knees, and it was really a moment of sort of calmness and makes you reflect of how powerful this time is that we're living through. So I ask Allah that for those of us that are experiencing difficulty in this time that we cannot bear, may Allah make it a time that we can bear. May Allah give us ease and patience for those of us that are our families that are struggling. And for those of us who have been blessed with this as an opportunity, COVID-19 as an opportunity, may Allah give us the strength to do justice to that opportunity. And I think for Islamic schooling, you know, for those schools that may have this as an opportunity, this time as an opportunity, I really hope and pray that we do justice to it. So I'd like to preface this session around that, inshallah. Now, thinking about this as potentially a gift, if inshallah, this moment in our history, in our time, is a gift for Islamic schooling, then I look at it this way. I say, look, in the first couple of weeks of COVID-19, many of us, I think as our school communities, were focused on the social and emotional well-being of our communities, of our students, of the parent community, and ourselves and our staff. We spent a lot of time transitioning into online spaces and really just supporting the well-being of our community. The second sort of phase to all of this was the economic phase, where we started realizing that you know, COVID-19 has a major economic impact on the families, communities, and as a result, our school. And we've had to make difficult decisions around staffing and fundraising and things like that, especially in Ramadan, because Ramadan's a time when we hope for the vast majority of the funding that we get in Ramadan, both masjids and schools. But in North America, at least, unlike Australia, but in North America, you're on the verge now of a summer holiday, inshallah. And I think this, inshallah, is an opportunity for renewal. If anything, we come back in September, whether we come back online or we come back in person, It's an opportunity for us to reflect and think about what we could be doing differently. And I think Brother William has really set this up nicely, to think about the importance of vision and to think about the importance of the why. This is an opportunity for us to think about renewal. I think if we, it's like somebody who goes through a sickness or sort of a life-changing experience. If you have a family member that's gone through something like that, what's the one thing that family member tells you is, they say, don't feel sorry for me. Use this as an opportunity to reflect on the difficulty I went through, so that you say to yourself, what would I do differently with my life? And similarly, I think COVID-19 is begging us to say to ourselves, how might we school differently in Islamic schooling? So I'd like to focus on that. And I think one of the big things that's on our minds, given that tarbiyah, given that character education, given that fostering akhlaq is an essential aspiration of, as far as I know, all Islamic schools, the big question for many of us, well, how do we then foster tarbiyah online? How do we do this in an online space? I mean, it was difficult enough, doing it in schools in person, and now we're in this online space. So I'd like to share a few thoughts around that. And I'm going to do this in two ways. I'm going to look at this from a theoretical perspective first, because I think the theory is what's going to shape the way we think about the practice. If I jump into the practical solutions immediately, you may not see the relevance of why, as Brother William said, why this is so critical. So bear with me for a few minutes on the theory, which is going to help us shift the way we think about character education. And I'm going to draw on the work of Abdullah Trevathan out of the UK, who's written a few really powerful articles, I think, on character education, ethos, and spirituality for Islamic schools. And I'll share the references at the end, but I'm drawing on his work. And then I'll share based on that, I'll share a few practical examples of ways that I think we can be moving forward, both in an online space and in person. So, okay, so where he starts off is he says that we've fallen prey in many ways, we as in a global culture, toward a management culture where efficiency, optimization, measurement, standardization, compliance have become sort of the calling of our day, and everything has to do with this sense of managerialism, and in many ways it's seeped into our conversations in schools, in religion and education. So he challenges that, and he says you can't always measure what's immeasurable. And character education is one of those things that's really immeasurable, but yet we try to measure. So he says, in almost every Islamic school, if you look at their vision statements, look at our vision statements, we mention something that says along the lines of, our Islamic school is distinct because we offer an Islamic environment, an Islamic ethos. We have, and then the way that's defined often is, he says, it's through the outward sunnah. It's out through the salahs, the du'as, the posters on our walls, the ambience of our school. But what he speaks about is moving toward from this outward to the inward sunnah and the character, the being that we have. So he explains that through two different views on ethos. He says there's a positivist view, and the positivist view is to say that it focuses on the right and wrong. For example, religious schools, and he talks about multiple different types of religious schools, where we attempt to preserve the values by virtue of looking out for infringements, which requires policies and regulations. So if you're constantly looking if our character education programs are based on the do's and don'ts, the rights and wrongs, you didn't wear the right uniform, or you said this wrong, or you brought a cell phone to school when you weren't supposed to, but it becomes based on the infringements, then that's very difficult to do online, because you no longer have that space, and you're no longer physically in the same room as our students, as our learners. So it becomes really difficult to then manage these infringements. And this is where, if this is our definition of character education, this is where it becomes really difficult, both in person, but also online. The non-positivist view, he says, is an ethos, a school ethos that's not managed or imposed, at least not directly, but arises naturally through social interaction. And it's woven into the social fabric of the institution. It's the vibe, it's the feel of the school. For those of us who've had an opportunity to visit other schools, and maybe for job interviews, or you've had a chance to visit other schools to do workshops and so on, you notice that sometimes when you walk into a school, you say to yourself, wow, this school has a vibe. It has a feel. Something's different. You walk into a really elite private school, or a school that has just a long pedigree of being around and functioning at a very high level, and you say, I can just feel a difference in this school. It's a feeling more than it is a policy. It's a feeling more than it is the regulations. And it's a feeling that comes from the way that interactions take place. So Trevathan explains that let's look at this as a maximalist and a minimalist approach. Maximalist is really what Brother William was speaking about. It's about the school philosophy. It's about answering the what, the why, the how of teaching. It's about fostering a sense of trust over compliance, yet still having very high quality outcomes. So it's about nurturing this sense of trust across the school, but thinking with staff collaboratively about what defines our school philosophy, defining that why, and ensuring that that why is infused across the entire school ethos and across every staff member, new and those that have been around for a while. The second approach is the minimalist approach. And the minimalist approach, he says, refers to what we can do at a classroom level. So at a classroom level, it's about the teacher's self-awareness, how aware they are of the students, their needs, their experiences, their life histories, their worldviews, what's on their mind, what's at a very deep level. It's having a deep sense of personal integrity as educators, a heightened awareness of social interactions between students, between ourselves. It's a greater sense of presence, authenticity, listening, genuine respect for children, and upholding the dignity of the learner. All of which we are all, I'm sure, committed to, but something that we could probably be reflecting on far more, including myself. It's something that should be part and parcel of what we do as in our reflective practice. So he gives these maximalist and minimalist approaches, but looking at this from from one perspective, he also talks about the concept of hudur, of having awareness, presence, spiritual awareness and presence in our classrooms. Now, we know that when we talk about tarbiyah, when we talk about imparting Islam, much of this is done through hearts. Much of this is done through one teacher to the next. All of us know, one teacher to a student. All of us know that, when you have a child in a school, the experience that they enjoy most about the school is when they connect with teachers, when they connect with particular teachers, and that teacher gets to know them at a very deep level. That comes from hudur, comes from presence. I myself, I've got a young son at home, and I often feel that I'm often distracted. I'm often just not focused. And he keeps saying to me, Baba, just turn, just listen, just be here. And it's a lesson for us, because we realize that presence makes such a huge difference. Oftentimes when we're task oriented, when we're largely focused on what we're trying to impart, or what we're trying to do, or the next thing we need to do, but we're not in the moment, it makes a huge difference in the psyche of the children that are in front of us. And this can be done online, or it can be done in person. I often give the example, I think to myself, yes, we're living in a time of COVID right now, but how do we stay in touch with our loved ones generally? I mean, when you're not able to see your loved ones, if your loved ones, like my parents live in, most of my family lives in Canada, I'm living in Australia, how do you stay in touch? You stay in touch via phone. And the tone that you have, the types of questions you ask, how often you inquire about somebody's health, or how often you inquire about somebody's day, that's what makes the difference. It doesn't matter whether we're in person or not in person. It's having that sense of presence and being in the moment. So Trevathan speaks about the educational challenges of today. And I think you can probably agree that for most of us, the students in our schools and our classrooms are at this point of just utter distraction. They're often very self-absorbed, given the context that we're in and the amount of social media that they're around. Stress and anxiety is very high, especially with standardized tests and with the pressures of academic performance. There's a lack of concentration often, an inability to be in the moment, even for ourselves as adults. We're easily drawn into the facade of things and disconnected from the world around us. Those are general, but how do we respond to that? Is you respond to that with a sense of presence. Contemporary levels of distraction, he says, call for an urgent action in cultivating hudur among students before any significant imparting of akhlaq can take place. Now, I think that's an important point, and that's why I've highlighted it. That in order for us to actually impart akhlaq, in order for us to foster a sense of character, the first thing we need to do is just be present and connect and listen. And the example of my son reminds me again and again that I can't convince him of anything, let alone, you know, eating his broccoli. I can't convince him of anything if I'm not actually present. So if I'm sitting with him at the dinner table, but I'm on my phone and I'm not actually connecting with him, how am I going to convince him of anything? How am I going to impart anything? How is my demeanor, my state going to have an impact on him? So similarly for us as school leaders, as educators, I think that's something that we should be cognizant of. Sorry, I think I missed a slide here. This is an important slide where he says, the second thing to think about is humility as a school characteristic. Now, going back to what Brother William said about thinking about the why and thinking about the vision of Islamic schools. Trevathan, mashallah, it's a beautiful article. I hope all of you get a chance to read it, but he says something really interesting. He says, you remember the example I mentioned earlier about the outward sunnah and sunan and the inward sunan. And he says, what if the ethos of our school was defined by humility? He says humility is a characteristic that is grounded in the Islamic tradition. It's not about the outward of us, you know, us doing salah, us in congregation, or us making dua in congregation, or us, you know, putting up the right posters on the walls. It's not the outward. It's the inward of who we are as individuals. And he says if an ethos of a school was defined by humility, it would be embedded into our school philosophy. It flies in the face of academic excellence and achievement, because no longer are you boasting about your achievement in relation to the other students' achievement, but it's a humility that Allah's given you this opportunity, Allah's given you this reward, this gift of achieving something, but that doesn't take away from somebody else's achievement. Humility is seen as a sign of weakness in global culture and yet revered in Islam. So it's such a juxtaposition between what young people are being faced with every day. Is you know, that whole sense of self-absorption, it flies in the face of that, because it says, no, this is an essential element in Islam. It's the opposite of pride, the opposite of self-admiration, and it effectively penetrates the core of our human struggle, our nafs. So he actually puts forward the argument of what if we tried to foster humility as a school characteristic, as the defining characteristic. So when somebody says, what is it that defines your school as making it distinct, you know, and you say, well, we're trying to foster a sense of humility, and you see that from the school leader to the parents, to the educators, to the students. Spoke about hudur, and now what? So let me get into the practical. I've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to jump into some practical suggestions of how to make this happen. I'm going to break up the practical, as Abdullah Trevathan has done, in the maximalist and the minimalist. Now, he doesn't give these suggestions, but I've sort of pieced this together. He doesn't give suggestions in the article. What he sort of does is give you the conceptual framework, which I've hopefully summarized sufficiently. But let's think about this as a maximalist and minimalist, and what we can be doing as educators from today, I'm hoping, inshallah, and including over the summer. So the first is thinking about this at a maximalist level. I've put the two articles that I've been drawing from on the right-hand side. One is called Spirituality in Muslim Education by Abdullah Trevathan, and the other chapter is called Muslim Ethos Within Muslim Schools. But what I would highly recommend is, I think this is an opportunity to begin a professional learning community. I'm sure all of you are familiar with PLCs, but also action research. Now, the essence of action research for your staff and for your school community is to begin reading. I think if you take a concept, like, for example, let's just take this as an example. You take this concept of the Islamic school ethos. You come up with a big question. Your big question is, how do we foster tarbiyah online, for example? And then you take two readings, like the ones I've given you. And as a staff, you read them. And together you say to yourself, okay, now let's begin to plan. How do we answer this question of doing tarbiyah online? You try something. Every school, every teacher has to take on a task and say, I'm going to try this in my classroom. I'm going to try something else in my classroom. And each teacher tries something different. You try it for a month, 2 months. You observe, you reflect, and then you iterate. So the action research model is really about not just about a reading group for the sake of reading, but it's taking an idea based on a specific focus. So you all as a school have a particular focus. You read something that's going to push your thinking, and then you try it, you observe it, you reflect on it, and you iterate, and you continue the cycle. Personally, I think this is something that just about every Islamic school should be doing if you haven't already. I would highly, highly recommend that, given that you're in the middle of May now, Ramadan is ending, start it in June, carry it through the summer, and come back in September with some, between now and June, if you get your staff to start reading these articles, having discussions online, and you start with some actions, some renewed actions in late August, early September, observe it for the first 2 months, and then iterate and reflect, you'd have an amazing action research model brewing. And then you continue this. New question, new reading, new questions, new readings. Or some school would continue new readings on the same question, new readings on the same question, and keep it for a year-long emphasis. But I really think at a maximalist level, at a school philosophy level, this might be one way for you to begin something at a more practical level to think about change. At a minimalist level, in terms of a classroom level, so people are thinking to themselves, okay, so Nadeem, you talked about how to do tarbiyah online, but what does that mean right now for today? For today, I think it begins with, number one, establishing presence. What I mean by that is preempt challenges with presence. I think what I tried to do this when I started this webinar by speaking about my own reflections on COVID-19 and this idea of it may or may not be an opportunity for all of us, and the challenges that we've all endured, hopefully was one way of connecting us. May have worked for some of you, worked for me because it puts me in the moment. It makes me realize what's my context that I'm in. It connects what I'm going to be saying in relation to the broader social, historical context that we're in. So it replaces distraction with centeredness. I've seen some speakers, when they start a session, they start off with a moment of silence. Some speakers start off with a moment of reflection. Some speakers start off with, centering yourself. This is something you can be doing with your students online now. You're on a Zoom call, you ask them all to stop, pause, make a dua, stop, pause, reflect on something. It also removes self-absorption with concerns for others. So it's no longer about myself, but it's about thinking about our global community. It's about thinking about our local communities. It replaces stress and anxiety, hopefully, inshallah, with calmness. So each of these have benefits. And this is something that I think you can probably start today. Even if you're a school leader and you're having staff meetings, this would be an excellent thing to do. At the beginning of your staff meetings regularly, establish some presence. The second thing is, at a minimalist level, is I think foster presence via story. Use story as a way of building akhlaq, building character. I've given 3 examples here. One is Dr. Frida Shama had developed a reading list, an English literature reading list, K-12, that's on the ISLA website, the Islamic Schools League of America website, and it's easily downloadable. But it has a list of books that are highly recommended that are value-based, not necessarily written by Muslims, not necessarily Islamic, but they are value-based. Reading value-based content, I've put also the Ghazali Children's Series, which is an excellent series, and Newer Kids, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, has an akhlaq building program. There's tons of resources out there. Please don't limit what I'm saying here to just these 3. And I'm not promoting any one particular of these 3. I just think there's lots of stuff out there. But to foster character and tarbiyah through story is a very powerful method. Doing it through story connects people to narrative, connects young children and young adults to narrative and to characters, as opposed to picking and sort of mandating policy and regulation. It gets them thinking in different ways. The third minimalist way at a classroom level is to foster presence via dialogue. And I'll give 2 examples here just before I close. That Yaqeen Institute, which is doing some amazing work out in the US, which I'm sure, again, all of you are familiar with, has these things called conversation cards, which I came across, which I'm sure some of you have already come across. But they're a way of fostering conversation on difficult questions. This is another way of fostering dialogue. You can get these downloadable cards. They're on critical questions, especially for sort of the high school teenage students. It's a great way of fostering dialogue and discussion. So those Yaqeen cards, conversation cards, are available online. And there's a number of other resources that Yaqeen also has, which are very, very rich. Another is the type of inquiry you're asking. I've shared 2 examples here. This is from a school in Dubai, an American Islamic school in Dubai called Next Generation School. And the school leadership over there has rolled out a program for inquiry-based learning, which is being facilitated online. And every grade level has a inquiry question that they're following that are, in this case, that are COVID related. So in grade 2, the big question is, how might our relationships affect one another and the world that we live in this current context? In grade 7, they're asking the question of, how might a global pandemic impact the health and well-being of society? Again, the types of questions you have, the types of inquiries you have, and they have one of these, they're linked to Hadith and Quran. They have an entire program that links Islamic studies into questions of inquiry across science, math, and etc. It's a full inquiry-based program. This is just 2 examples, but what it shows is that the type of dialogue you have with students gets them to have that sense of presence, connectedness, and calmness, as opposed to this anxiety that we spoke about earlier. So again, I would suggest that there's probably 3 ways, three larger ways to foster tarbiyah online. I mentioned through dialogue, through story, and through presence. And I really would highly recommend an action research model be rolled out at a maximus level with your school philosophy and your staff. I'll leave you with the final question of, what if humility defined the ethos of our Islamic schools? Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakumullah khairan, Brother Nadeem, for giving us that insightful talk, as well as some practical approaches. For our audience out there, mashallah, we're setting up the stage for you with Brother William, who had just now focused us back on the why we're doing things. Brother William had given us, that passion of I have a dream and that a sense of purpose. And now with Brother Nadeem himself with the tarbiyah, because as Islamic schools across the nation, our mission and vision is to culture that Islamic ethos, as you mentioned, Brother Nadeem. Jazakumullah khairan. One quote that really hit me when you were speaking is that, how do you measure the immeasurable? And I think because we're so involved in this pandemic and its planning, we kind of lose sight of some of the bigger picture items here. So thank you for bringing that back to the forefront as we go through this presentation. I know that there are several of you out there with questions that are coming through the chat that are asking about specifics and asking about, well, how do we open up the school next year? How are we going to be online? How do we split up the classes? And with that being said, I have Sister Layla, who's going to be delivering the last part of our content. But before we move to Sister Layla, does anybody have any questions for Brother Nadeem? We have the questions that you posed in the chat upon registering, as well as here, if there's anything out there. I think there's this one that is relevant, is how can we get parents involved so that they can they're careful and aware of what their kids are doing online, if we will be going to an online school in the future, part-time or full-time. Brother Nadeem, Brother William.
From my perspective, I think getting them into the conversation. I know one school that I spoke with, they said that they're having full weekly meetings that are open for parents to attend. And it's a way of getting parents understanding what's happening at the school, what's changing, and also giving them some tips and advice of how to stay connected. So I think, creating opportunities for dialogue is a great way. And if it's consistent, you never know when parents will come. So initially you might have a few, but over time, when the time is right, that opportunity will kick in, inshallah.
Right. And just to remind everybody also, when Brother William shared that graph of how involved you have your staff, I'm sure we could draw some parallels to that of how involved you keep your parents involved. It could be, like you said, Zoom meetings, surveys, just dialogues through parents that way. So, Jazakumullah khairan. All right, Sister Layla, I think the pieces that everyone's waiting for. Sister Layla is a PhD candidate in the Educational Leadership and Research Methodology at Florida Atlantic University. She's also currently the head of school at Nur al-Iman in New Jersey. She's been an educator for more than 20 years in both public schools and Islamic schools, and has led several schools to their initial accreditation. She's taught at all levels from preschool to university in her 20-year tenure. Her leadership roles include advisory board of the Youth Coalition of South Florida and Vice President of Florida Islamic Schools Association. As an educational consultant, Layla works on board development, leadership mentoring, teacher professional development, as well as school-wide assessments of operations. She's currently serving as the president of CISNA, Council of Islamic Schools of North America, and on the ISNA-CISNA Education Program Committee. Sister Layla, are you there? Sister Layla?
So one of the major problems is unmuting.
Right.
Assalamu alaikum.
Right.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. As-salatu was-salamu ala Rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I'm going to also turn on my camera. Okay. Alhamdulillah, I thank you, Brother William, Brother Nadim, for the insight. We are going to shift to a practical reopening plan, but we can't really look at the practical aspects until we really do what Brother William and Brother Nadim said, which is know what our vision and our mission is as a school, and then really understand how to live that mission, which is what Brother Nadim talked about. And that's something that we don't just do in a school building. It has to be something that we do internally. So whether we're on a computer screen or in a building or outside, we still have to maintain that. So I also want to start with a disclaimer. Planning for the next school year, we really don't know what we're going to have in September or in August, or what the situation is going to be like. So when we don't know what, then how do we plan? What we're going to talk about is how do we start the conversation about planning in the next few minutes. This is not an attempt to give answers. This is an attempt to give guidance in how to think about planning. And so I want everyone to keep that in mind, inshallah. So to begin, I'd just like to, a reminder again for myself and everyone, there is a great deal of uncertainty, but we've always had uncertainty. We've always known that it is not us who is in control. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control. So things happen that we do not plan for. But as Muslims, we are blessed with the gift of Iman, and knowing that even in all of this anxious world that we live in, and all these sometimes frightening things that we see, we are assured by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that there is a plan, there is wisdom, there's hikmah in why things are happening the way they are. So our iman allows us to ground ourselves in that certainty with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through our faith. So there's a huge blessing in that for us, where maybe the rest of the world has a lot more anxiety. We rely on our faith to guide us through this, and we need to keep that in mind, inshallah. We put our trust in Allah, right? He is in control. He is the one who plans. He decrees everything. But we also have to tie our camels. And so we have to have some planning done. Whether that comes through the way we plan it or not is another thing. And I also have a quote here from an author that Brother William mentioned, Jim Collins. Greatness is not a matter of circumstance. Greatness is a matter of conscious choice and discipline. So we saw Islamic schools come into this e-learning platform and do amazing things. And if we want to continue to show that we stand out as an educational institutions, that's a conscious choice that we make, and it is a disciplined process. It doesn't happen by chance. So now we need to plan, but this is not the same type of planning that we're accustomed to. So I want to touch a little bit on another theorist, Ron Heifetz, who talks about technical leadership versus adaptive leadership. And when we look at technical challenges, which is what we're accustomed to, and this is usually the way people deal with leadership, which is more the managerial style. The challenges are usually easy to identify, have quick and easy solutions, require small changes with known boundaries, and can be solved by an expert. And solutions can be implanted quickly. So something like a technical challenge could be creating a schedule. We would have normally had our traditional schedule. You give it to the academic director, some teacher leaders, and they come up with a schedule and it's done. But what we're looking at now is an adaptive challenge. And actually, usually what we have in our schools are adaptive challenges. We just tend to think of them as technical challenges. It's difficult to identify what the problem is. We can't put our finger on one single thing. There are a lot of, it requires changes in values, beliefs, in how we look at things. And that's a lot of what Brother Nadeem talked about, is we have to just look at things differently now. And it requires us not just thinking differently, doing things differently than we've ever done before. In light of the situation. And it is an opportunity to change the way we've seen Islamic education. And it's not solved by an individual. It takes a group of people from different areas who are living the problem. And there are no quick fixes. There's a required constant experimentation, which is kind of where action research comes in. So we know the situation we're in, and we try some things and some things don't work out, and then we try some other things. And that's where we are now, and how we need to look at dealing with the current pandemic. One of the most important things throughout this, for leaders especially, or at all levels, but beginning with leadership especially, is communication. Our communication with our staff, our parents, our students, our community has to be clear. It has to be transparent. It's okay to tell people that we really don't know what to do next. We're waiting for guidance, or there are a lot of unknowns. Being very transparent and honest, and being clear when we give guidelines, that we're clear in that communication. And making sure it's consistent. You can do it weekly or bi-weekly, but there has to be a consistent communication, especially to our communities. And as a leader, the followers sense how we feel. And so being calm and having tawakkul and having strength as well, from a humble place, strength, is important, because our community needs to know that it's going to be okay. We don't have control over everything, but we're going to do our best in what we do have control over. And then connecting, even though we're in a socially distant situation, making sure that we make connections with our parents and our students and our teachers, especially through live conversation, and having empathy with what they're going through. So in planning, everyone sent in a slew of questions about, when do we open in the fall? What will we do? Planning is not about having the right answers. So I'm not going to give you specific answers. There are some things, some guidelines that we can share. It's really about asking the right questions and having the right people at the table when those questions are being discussed. So who are the right people? Right now, we need to pull together. I mean, every school has their boards, their administrative team, a leadership team, but we need a different kind of group of people, more like a think tank, a task force. And that task force needs to include all stakeholders and experts. So it would include board members, teachers, administrators, parents, students if they're old enough to join, and then having people that are in the health field, helping with curriculum design, tarbiyah, scholars that can help us in that aspect. And then expanding the normal pool of people that we usually turn to. You'll need more people from different fields of expertise to really plan this out, because the bottom line is it's a safety and health issue. So first and foremost, we do need to protect our students and our staff, and make sure that we put things in place that provide for their safety. How do we recruit these people? Again, it goes back to using your why, your purpose, and your mission. And so we have experts in our communities, in our parent community, in our local communities, and really going out and recruiting people from different fields that can help really think through what is the best thing for us and how to tackle this and maintain our mission. How do we really teach our students, and how do we do schooling and maintain our focus on our mission? And then of course you take this task force, and it can be divided into teams to tackle different areas. And again, I'm going to preface this with saying that this is just one model of how this can be done. And so what I did was actually take the 3 areas or 3 buckets, put 3 buckets into the asking the right questions. In the first, which is the most practical area, which we received a lot of questions about, is facilities. How will we prepare for reopening the school? And I want you to keep in mind, please, as well, that I've gathered a lot of, in preparing for this presentation, I've gathered resources, and I share some of those on the last slide. And what I will do is actually add to those resources and put them in these 3 buckets. And when we send this or share this with the attendees, you'll have those resources as well, inshallah. So the first bucket is facilities, and then the second is administration. This is where we're talking about finance, the business plan, marketing, enrollment. And the third area is the core of who we are and why we exist, is our programming, and what will instruction look like in the fall. More important than anything else, and this is probably how most of us feel at this point, is to be flexible. I don't know about anyone else. Through these past couple of months, I felt like I've been standing on my head and trying to figure things out at sometimes. So being flexible with what student needs are, teacher needs are, what we do as a school, and really not sticking to what we would think of as traditional schooling. This is an opportunity to really take ourselves out of that box that we put ourselves in over the past 20, 30 years and try to do things that really impact our students and their ability to be practicing Muslims in the real world. So to begin, we're going to look at facilities. And of course, there are a slew of resources out there about what to do and how to prepare. Before I start here, we really don't know if come August or September what this landscape is going to look like. And because states have already started reopening, Allahu A'lam, I don't know if this pandemic is going to rise again. It dwindled because we were shut down and closed. I'm not sure that we're ready for reopening, but that's the way we're headed. So what happens between now and fall, Allahu A'lam. For facilities, I've broken this down into different areas. And I also have information, inshallah, at the end of this with some links that gives specific guidance on each of these areas so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to preparing. So the first is focusing on guidance. Our guidance will come from federal, state, and local agencies. So of course, the White House released Reopening America, and that's out there that's out there online. Sorry, I don't know what's happening here. The CDC just released a new list of guidelines for reopening in the fall. I think it was just a few days ago. OSHA also has guidelines. But really, this is going to be a state decision. So states will roll out, and some already have. Texas, I think, has, Maryland, Minnesota, I think Kentucky. There's a slew of states that already have put out guidelines for reopening and when and how reopening would occur. So you have to stay informed, specifically with your state. And of course, local conditions impact reopening. There's so much information coming out and it's constant. I would recommend having someone or a couple of people who just monitor the federal, state, and local agencies so that you have the most current information. Then we, with facilities, we look at site challenges. So it looks like the models that are out there now incorporate physical distancing, where students are actually 6 feet apart, seated 6 feet apart. For small schools like ours, private schools, maybe this is manageable. I'm not sure how they would do this with public schools where they have tens of thousands of students in their districts. But schools that reopened in Canada and Europe did reopen with physical distancing in mind, and I'll share a little bit of that later. Also zoning off certain areas where people might gather. So in schools where we usually had assemblies or lunch, those things would have to actually be zoned off. And that's what it looks like the plans ask for. And then program modification, student numbers may have to be modified. And I'm not sure how practical this is, but it looks like the path that we're headed towards is not allowing a full class or a full school in session. Wallahu alam, again, these are just things that have been rolled out and ideas that have come out. And that affects scheduling. So another area is screening. I would liken this process to probably 9/11. There was life before 9/11 and then life after 9/11. And the world, the way we did things just changed. So there's pre-COVID-19 and then post-COVID-19. And so screening is now going to become a part of what we do, whether it's going to be getting on a flight, which some airlines are actually doing, check your temperature before you get on. That schools have to check temperatures, make sure that staff come into work without a fever. And they're actually, selling these scanners, temperature scanners that can scan people as they walk through the door. And what does that process look like? Screening at the beginning of the year on a daily basis. Again, I think we need to just kind of set our minds to that things are just not going to be the way they were. And putting in protocols and policies for this type of screening, communicating that to parents, making sure that they understand what's expected. And then of course, there's going to be a required isolation area. Law samahallah, God forbid someone tests positive or is suspected to be positive, they have to be isolated until they can be removed from campus. And it can't be the clinic where sick children may come in. In the health and hygiene, again, this is something most of us implemented before schools closed, was the hand washing, sanitizing, making sure that we had enough supplies on hand. There were questions from some of the registrants about personal protective gear, masks, and some of the schools that reopened did reopen with requiring students and teachers to wear masks. And some of the guidelines that have come out from states show that their masks will be required. Again, that's something we'll have to wait and see, and it will depend on your local area. Cleaning and disinfection is not the way it used to be. There are specific guidelines. CDC did just release a whole slew of lists. There's also GBAC, has a very clear cleaning, sanitizing, disinfecting, and sterilizing definitions that we would have to abide by. And then putting, again, those into protocols and policies for our schools. And it's going to mean buying more supplies, different kinds of supplies, even different types of equipment. And I'll share some of that in a few minutes as well. Staff training, we will need new policies and procedures, new staff handbooks, new training. And we are going to have to give our staff new assignments, roles that did not exist before this, because now we're doing things differently. And again, the most important part of this is also communication. Whatever guidelines, policies, protocols we put in place have to be communicated to parents, students, teachers, and staff, especially on the screening part, so that we can prevent spread. And the recommendation is always to make sure that that's on our school websites. So there were several countries in Europe that reopened before the school year ended. And these are some themes that were apparent in what was applied once they reopened. There was strict guidance nationally that were put in place. Physical distancing was absolutely instituted. There were clear routes of movement in the buildings. There was no hovering. Students came in, had to stay far apart and only move in one direction. Student return was staggered so that younger students came back first. No busing, staggered start and end times, which meant that some students came in the morning and others came in the afternoon. No more food service the way it used to be. Again, the advice for and expectations of who could actually come to work, which is screening. Increasing cleaning and hygiene, Parents are not allowed to come visit anymore. So as schools, we wanted our parents in the schools volunteering. This is going to completely change that, so that the number of people on campus has to be minimal at all times. And of course, the smaller class sizes. New rules, no borrowing from each other, no games that require touching. I can't imagine what it would be like for us to be back in school and nobody can be near each other or getting children to understand that they can't touch their friends or play, especially younger kids. And then of course, constant cleaning in the classrooms. So these are some pictures from schools that reopened. You can see in the top left, that's actually a tent where some schools, and even in this country, I was on a call a couple of weeks ago where independent schools were asking, where can we purchase these tents that we can set up outside to expand the space we use for students? Then you have, there's taping off the teacher area so that the teacher doesn't come close to the students, hand sanitizing stations outside. And then there's the lower pictures is using the gym now for classrooms to maximize space use. Again, these are just more pictures of what schools look like on return. It seems surreal with students standing 6 feet apart and washing before they enter the building or using hand sanitizer. They move in one direction. Again, that's a model of what the desks would look like. The process, when we talked about the process of coming back into school, having screening stations for temperatures or self-screening through apps on iPhones. The equipment out there, there's some pictures of temperature scanners that could be installed in schools. And then the bottom picture is actually a sanitizing machine that you spray actually the sanitizing agent in classrooms after each class goes in. Again, these are things we never imagined or never had to deal with, but now they're out there. I also just included a few slides with some very specific things like the levels of cleaning. But this is in no way comprehensive. There's a lot more information added about specific guidelines for reopening facilities. And I'm sure that our districts, public school districts, will also come out with guidelines. So the next area, administration, this is probably one of the most frustrating because we're trying to deal with, we know our enrollment is going to be down. That's for independent schools across the country, no matter whether they're 300 years old and have an endowment of $100 million, or we're a small school with 50 students and no endowment and barely make ends meet with our budget. We're looking at the same scenario. People lost their jobs. People don't have the money to pay tuition. People are afraid to use that money to pay tuition because they don't know what's going to happen. So we're looking at planning for the fall. We're not sure about how many students we'll have, so we don't know how many staff we'll need. So that leaves us in a kind of in an anxious place. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to frame our planning around that. So how do we plan for being back in business when we really don't know? I'm going to go back to what both Brother William and Brother Nadim said. How we market our school at this point and market its value is going to make a huge difference. Parents are already saying, well, if we're going to be online, I might as well put my kids in public school. What's the difference? They're not going to be in a campus. They're not around non-Muslims, so I can just put them online. No, there should be a huge difference in what we offer as Islamic schools online versus what public schools offer online. And it goes back to what they both said about, are we really focusing on our mission and why we exist? And it's more than having rules like the Islamic environment. If that Islamic environment only existed in a building, then I'm not sure that we've actually succeeded in fulfilling our mission. That Islamic environment is something that we carry with us. It's the way we speak, the way we behave, our actions, the way we perform our ibadat, all of that. So our messaging to parents has to be that we as Islamic schools provide value that you can't find anywhere else. If we put our children in a public school setting, even if it's virtual, How often are they going to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout the day? How how many times will they be reminded of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? They're sitting, so that disappears. In our virtual setting, our children are still reminded. We still do dhikr. We still begin with dua. We still, even saying alhamdulillah, at the end of a lesson, or beginning with a dua to start the lesson, all of it, what our teachers say, what our classmates do, breaking our schedule up for salah, the fact that we stop and say, okay, we're not having class now because we have salah. Now it's on the responsibility of that child to go and pray. We're not walking them down to the masjid to pray. All of those things have to be communicated to our parents so that they can understand we're not losing the core value of who we are. So that argument of what's the difference between being virtual with a public school or Islamic school, there is a difference, and there should be a difference. And the messaging has to be there. How will we update policies, procedures, and protocols and best serve the community? Again, this is going to go back to some of our families have lost jobs or have lost families. And so how do we make changes that really meet the needs? And that's something that you actually have to be really in touch with what your family's needs are, where they are. And that comes through surveys, that comes through conversations, as was mentioned before. How do we manage a budget when we don't know what enrollment will be? We'll talk about scenario planning in a minute. It's not a surefire answer, but it gives you some foundation of where to start. How will we staff if we're not sure how many classes we have? Again, that comes with scenario planning. And of course, there's a big question. What are the legal ramifications and liability to reopening? In that, I'm going to defer you to legal, your school attorneys, or turning to someone who has a legal background to help with that. And they can also help with handbook policies and contracts. Again, this is what we talked about. Marketing your message is really important, and that should help you with your enrollment. And again, within budgeting, there should be a focus on fundraising for student financial aid. We're not worried about buildings. SubhanAllah, as Muslims, we were so obsessed with building buildings. We've spent like 20, 30 years building the most beautiful masajid, buildings and buildings and buildings. And then here we are, okay, we can't even access our buildings. And I was always a proponent of build the schools. The masjid just be a big square block where we go in and pray, but really focus on building our schools and establishing the viability of our schools. Alhamdulillah. So scenario planning, we're talking about enrollment. So you can create a budget. We all work on our budgets early on, probably starting January, February for the following year, anticipating we have about the same number of students. So at this point, we'd also need to create a budget with the anticipated decrease, if that's the case. Some schools said they have increases. So, but do create a budget with a few scenarios with different enrollment numbers so that you have an idea of where you stand. And you can also look at, if we're going virtual, if we're going to be virtual in the fall, do we just focus, put essentials teaching staff in the budget, and taking your staff roster in your teaching staff and your support staff, and really listing what the roles of each of those people would be and putting them in some kind of order. Because whether we like it or not, it's an awful thing to do. It's a difficult position to be in, but we're going to have to look at staffing and how that impacts our budget. And do we need to add additional staff like health and technology experts? And then another question is about tuition. This was something we dealt with when we went to emergency e-learning, was tuition flexibility. So that if we're online in the fall and we normally charged $5,000 for pre-K3, can we really charge $5,000 for pre-K3 if they're in a class for 90 minutes or 2 hours? And parents are asking, for discounts. There are some ways to do that creatively. Do we give discounts as in a percentage based on the month we're not in school? So you really have to think out of the box. For the younger grades, I can tell you for independent schools that are not Muslim, they're not changing their tuition. Tuition is as is, it's going to go through, but that's a difficult place to be in. We really have to be empathetic to what our families are going through and really focus on finding a way to raise financial aid funds to retain students. So speaking of funding, there's the CARES Act. I'm sure that most of you are already aware. The stimulus package that came out had state funding for K-12 schools. And the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, is pro-private schools. So there was a push to ensure that non-public schools got funding. And you don't need to qualify like the Title I and Title II qualifications. It was just based on numbers. There are two sources, the governor's education, something, I can't even remember, relief. And then the elementary and secondary school emergency relief, education relief, cover a variety of needs. When you look at what you can use those funds for, it can be anything from purchasing technology, from having companies come in and clean the school, to maybe even giving parents the ability to help with tuition. But it's very state specific. The funds go to the states and then they decide how they distribute that. And some of the states are already refusing to give non-public schools. So you have to check with your state Department of Education, your ombudsman, and see how you can advocate. I know CISNA and ISLA advocate along with CAPE for non-public school funding, but you're going to have to look at your state specifically and see what's going on there. And then check with your LEA specifically to make sure that you have access to these funds. There's also, I've provided a couple of links for this as well.
Sister Layla.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to bring it up to you that we're looking short for time. Inshallah, I know you still have a few slides left remaining.
Okay, I'll zip through these.
Okay.
Legal ramifications, again, I would recommend speaking with an expert on making sure that you're in compliance. Programming, teaching and learning, ways school may look different in the fall. We talked about phased or staggered return with younger grades first. I actually mentioned all of this already, that class sizes would be smaller. So again, here, we would do scenario planning with what it would look like if we were completely online, on-site, which I doubt is going to happen, completely on-site, or would be on-site and then online, off and on again, depending on the situation. The factors you have to consider are scheduling, curriculum, staff, and technology for each of those scenarios. This is a sample schedule of what some schools used. So again, I said throw traditional schooling out the window because we're looking at, we have to do things differently. And some even went to a 6-day school week where 3 of the days, one group came to school and then the other 3, the other group came, or an afternoon and a morning slot. Again, you can take a closer look at that. Planning, again, we've repeatedly said this is a mindset and a process. You have to know that planning mode is always on. It's not just, this is it and then we're going to do it. It's actually going to be a fluid process, and it may need to change for whatever reasons that we have to deal with at any given time. So what are next steps for Islamic schools? We're really looking at, there's so many things that we need to talk about. It's the ISNA maybe planning series. How do we collaborate at a national level as Islamic schools? Do we put together a national task force and then prepare a series of webinars on specific topics? We had a lot of questions on instruction and scheduling, so we'd have to address those. Here's a slide with links. I'm going to actually add a few more based on your questions, and inshallah we'll share all of this with you. Sorry, that went really fast. I know there were a lot of questions, but again, it's just a guide. It's not meant to give you specific answers right now. Jazakumullah khair.
Jazakumullah khairan, Sister Layla. I appreciate the time, and I'm sorry that I had to rush you. It's just we want to be careful of everyone else's time. I know we had a late start. With that being said, does anybody have any questions? And as your questions are rolling in, I just wanted you to watch a short video. It's about 4 minutes long, and we'll send you the link if you are interested in sharing it with your staff or even students. Okay.
Tell me the one about the virus again, then I'll go to bed.
But my boy, you're growing weary, sleepy thoughts about your head.
Please, that one's my favorite. I promise just once more.
Okay, snuggle down, my boy, though I know you know full well. The story starts before then, in a world I once would dwell. It was a world of waste and wonder, of poverty and plenty, back before we understood why hindsight's 2020. You see, the people came up with companies to trade across all lands, but they swelled and got much bigger than we ever could have planned. We'd always had our wants, but now it got so quick. You could have anything you dreamed of in a day, and with a click. We noticed families had stopped talking. That's not to say they never spoke, but the meaning must have melted, and the work-life balance broke. And the children's eyes grew squarer, and every toddler had a phone. They filtered out the imperfections, but amidst the noise, they felt alone. And every day the skies grew thicker, till you couldn't see the stars. So we flew in planes to find them, while down below, we filled our cars. We'd drive around all day in circles. We'd forgotten how to run. We swapped the grass for tarmac, shrunk the parks till there were none. We filled the sea with plastic, because our waste was never capped, until each day when you went fishing, you'd pull them out, already wrapped. And while we drank and smoked and gambled, our leaders taught us why. It's best to not upset the lobbies. More convenient to die. But then in 2020, a new virus came our way. The governments reacted and told us all to hide away. While we all were hidden, amidst the fear, and all the while, people dusted off their instincts. They remembered how to smile. They started clapping to say thank you, and calling up their mums. And while the car keys gathered dust, they would look forward to their runs. And with the skies less full of voyagers, the earth began to breathe, and the beaches bore new wildlife that scuttled off into the seas. Some people started dancing, some were singing, some were baking. We'd grown so used to bad news, but saw good news was in the making. And so when we found the cure, and were allowed to go outside, we all preferred the world we found to the one we'd left behind. Old habits became extinct, and they made way for the new. And every simple act of kindness was now given its due.
But why did it take a virus to bring the people back together?
Sometimes you've got to get sick, my boy, before you start feeling better. Now lie down and dream of tomorrow, and all the things that we can do. And who knows, if you dream hard enough, maybe some of them will come true. We now call it the Great Realization. And yes, since then there have been many. But that's the story of how it started, and why hindsight's 2020.
Because if you look at the camera, they know someone's filming it because they...
All right, just to kind of bring it back to full circle, you know, and I leave you with a question. Do we want to go back to the normal that we had, or is this a right time for us to really revolutionize our teaching methods and maximize our tarbiyah? It all comes with the positivity that William mentioned, the hudur, or the being present of Brother Nadeem, and then also having tawakkul and carefully planning with all of the stakeholders, inshallah, that are out there. Our next steps as a CISNA group, we would want to create a group of Islamic school leaders to be part of a national task force for Islamic schools to brainstorm our various scenarios based on the evolving information that we're having. With that being said, does anybody have any questions? Okay.
Again, Idam, I just want to remind everyone, and Brother Nadeem talked about this, this isn't an opportunity for everyone, which is true. And this pandemic showed the disparity of the levels in society, right? There are people who are barely surviving, don't have enough food. Our masajid are literally handing out food boxes to the local communities. So this pandemic for us, we are in a place of privilege. As Muslims in Islamic schools, as difficult as it gets, we have a support system within our communities that many people don't have. So a reminder to be grateful for that. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. But also to really take this opportunity to rethink the way we've done schooling all these years. Do our children leave our schools really with that? I always thought of Islamic schools as a place of where our children built a shield, and a shield that began internally and then built a shield around them, and it was based on their iman, and it had to begin internally, but then surround them like this force field. And are we really helping them build that force field? And we have an opportunity to do things differently, and I do hope that we take that opportunity to do just that.
Alhamdulillah. I know Sister Muniba asked a question saying that currently in their state, there's a requirement that a school day has to be at least 5 hours of instruction and 176 days. But if they switch to the morning and the afternoon shift or the flex shift, this requirement may not be met. Have any states changed these standards or plan on doing so? Might be too early to ask. My response to you, Sister Muniba, is that each state will be giving you some flexibility if they're mandating you to have flex hours or a socially distanced percentage of occupancy in your building. Your state will inform you definitely that they would have relaxed some of those requirements. Anybody else would like to contribute to that?
I just wanted to add, I think for your to your response, that yes, every state is doing different things, and also some of the questions that were asked are very specific. And unfortunately, with the way things are changing so quickly, and we're getting new information every single day, even with the guidance from the Department of Education, they say one thing and then there's challenges, and so now they're saying something else. We really just have to, and we were talking at ISNA about doing this, have maybe a series of these webinars or meetings or discussions so we can kind of stay caught up with each other, get suggestions from each other. There are no experts right now. There are no answers. Even the people who we consider to be experts are saying, I don't know, we don't know. And you hear that on television, on the news. So I just wanted to say that it's not that we're ignoring the questions some of you have asked, but we don't have all the answers right now. This is going to be an ongoing discussion, conversation, inshallah.
I would add on to that what Sister Sophia has said, and Sister Layla had referenced that there are some states that have released guidance. I did receive in Kentucky, which is where I am, a 15-page document, and this is publicly available. I can share it if anyone would like it to see an example. Keep in mind, each state is different. Kentucky is not the same as New York in terms of the situation, but to kind of go on to the idea of questions, that really this document just says it's expected to evolve as more information becomes available, and that schools are expected to remain flexible as new information becomes available. And really the whole document doesn't tell you what to do. It just says, here's a scenario. It's exactly the content that you received today. It said plan for scenario A, B, or C. And then it goes on for health and safety, and it has, just for health and safety, it has a list of about 30 guiding questions with no answers. It's just, how will you provide this and this and this? Consider how you will do this. So the truth is, right now it's about asking the right questions. And also, I really think that as the situation evolves, we can really share with each other what we are doing as that information becomes clearer. And I think having that think tank, having those us come together, is really going to be crucial for that, because we're all in similar situations together, and all of us have the same need, the same intention to help our students. And I think together we will do a lot more.
Absolutely. And as CISNA works to provide that think tank, we ask that you support CISNA in doing so. I know that you all don't hear it enough. I know that you're working day and night tirelessly around the clock. We appreciate you. Each and every one of you. We appreciate all the efforts, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continue to preserve you for you and your communities, inshallah. I'm going to conclude with a dua. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we beg you for your steadfastness in our affairs. We beg you to enable us to show us gratitude for all of your bounties and worship you with the best of devotion always, and especially in these last 10 days of Ramadan. Ya Allah, give us the wisdom to handle the affairs of our school and to serve our students, families, and staff. Ameen. Jazakumullahu khairan for attending today. Subhanallah wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfirullah wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.